Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Baseball Podcast. We're recording this on May 28th, so the day before Memorial Day. Tom, we're doing a Memorial Day special episode. We were just talking about how all you hear about when you think of, military service and baseball is, the legends, and there's nothing wrong with that. You hear about Ted Williams and Warren Spahn and Bob Feller and these guys that served during, World War II in particular, and all the amazing feats they did. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's amazing. We should probably do an episode on that later. But we wanted
Yeah, on
today,
Veterans Day.
on
Well,
Veterans Day, yeah. We wanted to take some time today to go over the handful of players, major league players who have died while serving the United States, because they're players that, as far as I know, you don't hear about. I had never really heard about any of these guys before I started looking into it. But I think it's important, because yeah, a lot of guys have served, but only I think there are 13 names on here that, pay the ultimate sacrifice. And I think we should take today or Memorial Day when this comes out
right.
to honor them. So
Yeah,
that's
this is more of the history podcast for today, although, it's all baseball related, so fear not. Those of you who like baseball and we're sitting there saying they did a football podcast and now they're doing a history podcast. Don't worry. Don't worry.
I
There's plenty
suppose
of
we are
baseball to talk about.
I suppose we
So,
are branching out a bit, but yes, we're keeping it baseball centric. Don't
right.
worry. And I
Well,
will say,
we both really love, we both really love history and baseball happens to be the sport that I would say has the most, history or like Americana involved in it. So this is a good crossroads of things that we both care about a lot. So it was inevitable.
yeah, that's a good point. That's a good way to put it. And I will say one thing that I thought was interesting while I was researching this. I don't know if you found this, Tom, but there was a website called Baseball's Greatest Sacrifice, which was
I
invaluable
did
while I
look
was
at that.
doing this,
Sure did.
and they had all the deaths during all the wars, and also some guys who died during peacetime, of anybody who died while serving that have played baseball. But it went down to not only Major League Baseball, not only the minor leagues, but college players, semi-pro players, umpires, things like that. And the lists were just unbelievable. I mean, I didn't have time to go through all of it. But
Right.
you wouldn't believe it. Like, you even went to like Afghanistan. There was a guy who was killed who played in the minors. There were a couple of college ball players and stuff like that. So we're focusing on the major leagues today because we had to pare down the list. And
Right.
that's also, I guess the biggest point of interest with the baseball podcast. But I just wanted to point
hmm
out that it's not just these 13 guys; it's plenty of guys, and it
Right.
goes all
This
the way
is
back
not
to
an
the Civil War.
exhaustive list, to be
No,
sure.
not by any means. And it's also amazing to me that it goes all the way back to the Civil War, of players in any capacity in baseball who've died while serving. So I thought that was just something that we should note before we jump into our MLB guys. Anything else you wanted to say, Tom?
Um, no, I think that was good. I mean, I'm thinking my first thought is like next Memorial Day, and maybe not minor league players. I feel like that would be a long podcast, but they do like umpires or something.
Something like that. Or I was
Yeah,
thinking, I think there were two minor league guys who received the Medal of Honor. Maybe it's something like that.
yeah, something like that.
Or like, yeah, there were a couple of Distinguished Service Cross guys. We could do something like that,
hmm
of just incredible stories. But that's something we can tackle later. Like you said, we could
Yeah,
do Veterans Day. And I will say most of these guys are World War One. There are a couple of World War Two. There are a couple of Korean War guys. But we wanted to, well, why don't you take it? Why don't you tell them?
well, so my thought was that we should do this in chronological order, and it just so happens that Ethan and I, despite being 99% the same exact person, our interests in history do lie in different locations. So there's some crossover for sure. But for example, Ethan doesn't really know anything about World War One, and I've done a lot more reading about it than he has. So the way we decided to split it up was that, like you said, there's 8 World War I guys on this list. So I did 6 of them, and then Ethan covered the rest of the guys. So we're going to do it in chronological order, so we're going to be jumping back and forth. And at least the way I played this, I don't know if you did it like this, but I didn't look at all at any of the guys that Ethan did because I want to be learning along with you guys. So, we're going to be doing a little bit of an audience surrogate type thing when Ethan's on the mic. So
Yeah,
feel free to look at me as sort of the avatar of everything you've ever cared about.
Yeah, absolutely. Two of your guys I'm familiar with just because they have pretty incredible stories of being killed in action.
Hmm.
And that was hard to get away from when I was researching this, but a couple of the
Right.
other guys I'm sure I've never heard of. And yeah, I think that's important to be able to ask questions and stuff and not just rattle off um, a bunch of information. And I will say I'm not an authority on any of these players, so I don't pretend to have
Hmm.
all the answers or anything. So if you ask me something, I might just say, sorry, man, I don't know. I just
Yeah.
jotted down notes, but I'm going to do the best I can because I think a lot of people have never even heard these names before. So I think it's
Right.
important that we do it. So yeah, I think we can just jump right in unless there's anything else you wanted to say.
Now let's start with the Spanish American War.
All right. So the first player up that we found in chronological order is a guy named Bill Stearns. And so I have that Bill Stearns was born in 1853 and he served in the Civil War, despite the fact that he was only 12 years old when the Civil War ended. So it's not clear whether, because there were, children basically who served in the Civil War. They were drummer boys, messengers, orderlies, things like that. So I would assume he didn't see action. But he was a member of the Grand Army of the Republic, which was sort of the organization for Civil War veterans. So it is proven that he was in the Civil War in some capacity and he did serve. So that's remarkable in and of itself.
Okay.
Um, but then after the Civil War, like I said, it ended when he was 12 years old. He grew up. He went on to play 5 big league seasons with the Washington Olympics, Flash Nationals slash Blue Legs. I guess they had a lot of name changes, as well as the Hartford Dark Blues. And I really like that there are just a bunch of colors in the names back then.
Yeah,
I guess there
this
still
is
are now.
such old time baseball
It is.
nomenclature.
It is.
Like
But there's
it's
still,
never like, well, like once you get into like the tens and the twenties, you start to get into like, oh, let's name it after birds or whatever. In like the
yeah.
1800s, it's always like, the Worcestershire orange eyes.
Yeah, exactly.
There's always a color, and it's always like, dude, this is such a mouthful. What are
It's
we
really
doing?
old. Yeah. Well, I literally have on here the Washington Olympics slash Nationals slash Blue Legs. So he played for all those different teams.
Right. That's another thing
He,
is teams used to change their names constantly.
yeah,
Like
there's a lot of
especially
turnover.
minor league teams would change like yearly.
Yeah. So this is something that I thought was really interesting because it's super old timey baseball. Stearns pitched 699 and two-thirds career innings with a 4.28 ERA, which doesn't seem that bad by modern day standards.
Is
That's
that his
solid.
is that his major league record?
That's his major league ERA,
Okay.
4.28 across 699 two-thirds, so 700 innings.
Okay.
He holds the record for the lowest baseball reference WAR of all time at negative 9.5,
Oh, really?
which I guess that means he pitched for long enough, not particularly effectively, that he racked up almost minus 10 WAR, which is remarkable. But
I mean, I
he hung,
guess pitching exclusively in the dead ball era, 4.23 ERA
yeah,
is like pretty high.
yeah. I just thought that was
So,
remarkable. So hey, he pitched 5 years in the big leagues. It's more. That's 5 more years than we'll ever play.
yeah. Well, but hey,
So
listen, don't
don't
count us
rule it
out,
out. Don't rule it out. So, well after his playing career ended, Stearns enlisted in the Army once more at age 45 upon the outbreak of the Spanish American War. And the Spanish American War isn't super, super important to American history. We don't need to get into it, but it was just a war with Spain that took part in a lot of places that weren't Spain or the United States. So, like Cuba, the Philippines, things like that.
Mhm.
So, we don't need to get into the reasons why. Um,
Right.
Serving with the 1st District of Columbia Volunteers, so he volunteered, he wasn't drafted. Stearns took part in the American landings in Puerto Rico in July of 1898, but became ill during this time. Having contracted malaria, Bill Stearns was sent back home along with the rest of his company in mid September, but was unable to recover. Stearns died in late December at the age of 45, becoming the first player in the history of MLB to become a casualty of war, as well as the only player to die during the Spanish American War. So I think that's kind of a remarkable life. He went from maybe the most important war in American history, the Civil War, grew up, played in Major League Baseball, and then enlisted again at 45 to go fight in another war, and then got sick and died of illness. So
Right.
it's
I
just a
think
remarkable life to me.
this is more of a history thing and less of a baseball thing, but it is kind of interesting how his career kind of traces from the U.S. arguably at its lowest point. Civil War is probably the lowest point in American history, to uh, the Spanish American War is kind of when the United States puts itself back on the map as a world power. So prior to the Spanish American War, you know, the United States is over there. Nobody in Europe really takes them that seriously. But then they go up against Spain and they win and they take
Decisively.
territory from Spain.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, the United States is on the map as a world power. They're not, what they are post World War II and now, where they're, arguably the only superpower. Although that's less true now. But after World War II, and especially after the fall of the Soviet Union, the United States is on top. At this point, they're just one of the world powers. But it's, his career sort of tracks the rise of the United States the same way that, I don't know where I was going with the second half of that. But that's just,
That's okay.
that's something that I thought was cool about that story.
Yeah. And I just want to point out, like, how amazing is it that he re-enlisted at 45? Like, it wasn't like he was a young man who got drafted or he got all the pressure of, you're 24 years old, go fight. He was 45. I'm sure he easily could have gotten away with not, and he decided it was the right thing to do, and he died for it. So Bill Stearns, American hero. Now we're going to jump into World War I. We don't have to go chronologically by like, oh, this guy was October and this guy was September.
We're not going to do that.
Yeah, so why don't you just give one of your World War I guys, and then I can do another one.
So the first thing I wanted to do was World War I is a conflict that it's very different for Americans than it is for Europe. Because in Europe, World War I is stuck in their cultural memory. They make movies about it. It really is something that Europe kind of never got over in terms of like the way that it affected their like national psyche. And for the United States, like a lot of people are just like, oh, well, that was like World War II's like, that was spring training for World War II.
Right.
They just look at it like, oh, it's mostly the same sides. The Germans, we fought the Germans and they were monsters. So, it's just World War II Part 1, which is, there is some truth to that, but I wanted to go a little bit into World War I, not like super deep, but basically just like the American experience with World War I. So, more or less, we talked about the Spanish-American War, and that was one of the first times that the United States really got involved with a European power outside of, the American Revolution and like the War of 1812. For most of American history up to that point, the idea was don't get involved with Europe. That was what George Washington recommended, and they largely didn't do it. This is when the United States starts to assert itself as like a colonial power in the Spanish-American War. So they go to war with the Spanish, they win, they take some territory. But come 1914, when World War I breaks out, the attitude is still largely do not get involved with Europe. So World War I breaks out, the United States is not allied with any of the powers that are involved in the war, so the U.S. remains neutral. But the difference here is that the United States is culturally closer to the allied powers, which is Britain, France, later Italy, but not initially, and Russia. So that's called the Triple Entente, and they're particularly the French and the British. The United States are culturally friendly with these two countries. They're very suspicious of the Germans. I don't think the United States and the Austrian Empire really had much, relations at all. So basically, we are neutral, but U.S. industry and our financial institutions are only dealing with the Allied powers. So if we ever do get involved, it's going to be on the side of the Allied powers because we do not like the Germans. And during this time, we're being fed propaganda from the British and all that type of stuff. So what the Germans end up having to do is they have to do one of two things. They have to either keep the U.S. out of the war, or they have to do something to keep the U.S. from being like a meaningful contributor to the war. So over time, the U.S. opinion of Germany worsens and worsens. This is partially because the Germans were letting their subs sink anything that wasn't flying a Central Powers flag, which meant American ships or ships that had Americans on them. Famously, they sink I think it's an ocean liner, some sort of passenger ship called the Lusitania. And it later is shown that the Lusitania was carrying war supplies over to Britain, but at the time that wasn't known. And what was known is that there were Americans on board who were killed. So the United States, they do not declare war during this time, but, they come real close. So the U.S. at this point, they don't like the Germans at all. They want the Allied powers to win. They're just not ready to go to war yet. But then the Germans, they see that, the U.S. is very close to getting involved. So they decide to try to head this off. So this guy who is the foreign minister named Alfred Zimmerman sends a telegram to Mexico, and he says that if the U.S. joins the Allied powers, if Mexico declares war and invades and basically distracts the United States so they can't get involved in Europe, that if the Central Powers win, they will support returning the territory that Mexico lost in the Mexican-American War. So I don't know if Texas was one of the
Texas was
territories they would
not.
get back.
That was the Texas. It was like New Mexico, Arizona,
Well,
part
I
of
mean, I don't know
California.
if they were promised Texas, but I know they were promised
Oh,
everything they lost in the Mexican-American War. So what happens is the British intercept this telegram immediately, as Zimmerman expected them to, but he didn't expect them to break the cipher so quickly and be able to read it. So the British break the cipher immediately and send it right over to America. And they're like, you see what Germany's trying to pull here, guys? Come on, what do you think? And, you know, at this point, this is the last straw. Yeah, isolationism in the United States pretty much just, you know, is washed away. And on April 4th, 1917, so 3 years into the war, the United States finally gets involved. And the war ends in November 1918. It ends on what is now Veterans Day, November 11th. So the U.S. is only involved in World War I for about a year and a half. And this is 1917, so it takes some time to get our military build up and get it over there and get it involved. So the U.S. is not in World War I for very long. So this is why in the United States, you know, again, there's much less cultural impact from World War I than there is in Europe, because the Europeans, it was fought in Europe. It was the bloodiest war they had ever seen up to that point by far. And it basically entire countries have PTSD from World War I at this point.
right.
But so the big surprise here is, like we mentioned, 8 of the 12 MLB players who died in who died in these wars died in World War I. And
Right.
you know, it's weird because again, we were only in there for about a year and a half.
Well,
And
I think one of the things to keep in mind is that, as far as I know, and you're a lot more knowledgeable in World War I than I am, but I think one of the things that's important to keep in mind is that, you know, we think about World War II, and we think about the attack on Pearl Harbor and how the next day lines are out, you know, at recruiting places were you know, out the door, and everybody was trying to enlist and stuff. It's my understanding that it was pretty much that way with World War I as well. Like, pretty much every able-bodied man was expected to serve.
right,
Everybody
yeah,
served. You always knew somebody who served. You probably knew somebody who was wounded or got killed. So it was like World War II in that regard, of like everybody was involved. So it stands to reason that, you know, a lot of baseball players would have taken part. And there were a lot of baseball players who did take part that didn't get killed. I know Babe Ruth
right,
was in the National Guard. Ty Cobb and Christy Mathewson served in, I don't know off the top of my head, but some sort of like chemical weapons
mm-hmm.
detachment. And actually that contributed to Christy Mathewson's death. We didn't put him in this list because he died long after that, but
Right,
I think
yeah,
it was proven that his exposure to, I think, chlorine gas or mustard gas, whatever they were using, like messed up his lungs, and that contributed to his early death, I think like in his 30s. So that's another guy I guess you could include on this list that I didn't think
right,
about.
yeah.
But so yeah, World War
That would
One
be a
definitely affected Major League Baseball.
mm-hmm. Yeah. So what I was thinking about while I was doing this research was I was wondering why the majority, you know, 2/3 of these guys died in World War I, when you would think that it would be more World War II. And I have two theories, and I don't feel confident about either one of them.
I have a
Um,
theory too. I want to hear yours.
my first theory is that since it's pre-live ball era, and this is the before baseball players are, you know, Babe Ruth level celebrities, these guys are less likely to get special treatment. And it's not like I'm accusing guys after that of getting treated with kid gloves, because some of them specifically volunteered for combat missions. Like I think Ted Williams did,
Yeah.
right? But like, you know, it's a little hard to get around. Like in the 40s and the 50s, baseball is the national pastime at this point. These guys are the biggest celebrities in the country, like other than movie stars. They're probably going to get some special treatment, whether or not they want it. World War I, that's not the case. I don't know that that's the reason. That's just one of my thoughts. My other thought is that as I read about these guys, a lot of them are either fringe players or they're just retired by the time the war breaks out. So there probably aren't a lot of better options for them than joining the military, just because, and I mean, this is true even to this day. If you have a baseball career and you start early, you're not building a whole lot of like other skills that you're going to be able to work on and, have a career with after your baseball career ends. So a lot of these guys, there may not have been much better for them to do than join the military. There is one big exception who we'll talk about, and that
Yeah.
that guy is why I'm not confident about this theory either. So
Well,
what is your theory?
I think both of your ideas are sort of what I was going to say in that yeah, well, first of all, right, like you said, in World War II, baseball had grown a lot to that point, and it was the American pastime. I think in World War One, obviously baseball was still a huge part of American culture, but it wasn't quite the same amount of superstardom
Right.
that it was in World War II.
Yeah, because
And
literally specifically because you haven't had Babe Ruth yet.
yeah, we exactly. Or at least he hadn't become Babe Ruth yet.
Right. Yeah.
So I think that's part of it. And there's a famous quote, and I'm paraphrasing. I don't have it off the top of my head, but Bob Feller, who I think was the first player to enlist after Pearl Harbor. Hank Greenberg had
Hmm.
enlisted before Pearl Harbor and then reenlisted. But Bob Feller was the first player, I think, December 8th, he enlisted in the Navy. And he said something to the effect of, I didn't want to have a cushy job passing out bats and balls and building ball fields out of coral reefs. I wanted to see combat. And he did. He
Hmm.
served on the USS Alabama, and he saw a lot of combat. But and there were guys like Ted Williams who refused to not see combat. But there were guys like Joe DiMaggio who went around and they did like propaganda stuff for the army, and they served on service baseball teams and things like that. And there's nothing wrong with that. The needs of the army, they'll tell you what
Right.
they need from you. And obviously they deemed that important. But I think a
Right.
lot of
Well,
times
building
players,
morale is, if you're running the army, if you're, a general or whatever, like building morale is just as important, if not more important than having one extra guy on the
right, right. So
battlefield.
so
So,
there's nothing wrong with the Joe DiMaggios of the world going around and doing these PR things. That, like you said,
right.
it's an important part of maintaining the morale of the army. So I think that was obviously a reason why a lot of these guys, weren't killed. Um, and then, like you said, a lot of times it would be fringe players. So a lot of these guys you'll see played in one big league game, played in a
Hmm.
handful of games, maybe a few seasons. So they probably weren't going to get the same star treatment like a guy like Joe DiMaggio, who they would say, we don't want you to get killed. Um,
Right.
I don't know if you can prove that. I don't think there are any records of people saying these things to guys like Ted Williams or Joe DiMaggio or anything. It's just a
Right.
theory. And it's also like war is random. Like certain people are going to get killed, some people aren't going to get killed. There are plenty of players who got maimed, who got wounded, you know what I mean, who did but
Hmm.
didn't get killed. Um, and there are players who sustained injuries that later on would go on to affect their lives, but it didn't lead to immediate death. So it's war is a random thing, So it's I don't know
Yeah.
if there's any one reason we can point to and say, wow, how come baseball players didn't die? But yeah, I think all of these are probably reasons that contributed to the remarkably low number of, because I think we'll get into World War II later, but there were over 500 MLB players, current and future MLB players who served, and only two of them died, which is a remarkably low number if you look at a subset of the population that served. So it's, I think,
Hmm.
probably all contributing factors, and also just the
Right.
randomness of war. Anyway, now that
Yeah.
we got the background of
Yeah.
World War One out of the way,
Let's talk about World War One, guys. So we'll start with this guy who's his name is Bun Troy. Okay, and that's not his real first name, but we'll get to what his real name is. This is one of the guys I wrote the most about because I thought he had this interesting story where it seems like this dude had more potential than maybe, his teams were willing to give him credit for. So let's get into Bun Troy. So born Robert Troy in Germany in 1888. Bun's family moved to the USA at some point during his childhood. A lot of these guys, their early life is just fog. No one knows.
well, it
So
was a
we know
long
they
time ago.
moved.
Record
Yeah,
keeping.
yeah. The only reason there's records of these guys at all is because they played baseball. So his family moved to the USA at some point during his childhood and settled in McDonald, PA, just outside of Pittsburgh. So he plays indie ball for his hometown team, and this is what I thought was amazing: is he averaged 11K per nine during that stint.
Wow, back
For,
then.
yeah, for those of you who don't know, this is an era where double-digit K9 totals are just flat out unheard of. Like
Yeah.
Walter Johnson, for example, is like the strikeout king during this time, and his highest, I think, is 7.4 K9. So
Wow.
this dude was mowing batters down. This is like the Spencer Strider of, the early 1900s. Um, so understandably, this gets the attention of a scout for the Phillies, and he gets added to the Phillies in 1909. He does not make any appearances for them because it's late in the season. So he ends up going to spring training with them in 1910, and he does not make the team. And the cited reason is that he has the stuff and he has the curves, but he acts like an amateur on the field, which
So they didn't like his attitude?
that doesn't sound like a great reason to me to get rid of a dude who has that kind of strikeout stuff. So, we do not see him play Major League Baseball for another 2 years. So during this time, he floats around in the minors. I think he has one good year, or he has one like kind of not good year, and then he has a career year for the Adrian Lions, another great minor league team from 1912. So at the end of the minor league seasons, he impresses enough that the Tigers pick him up, and he makes his only MLB start on September 15th, 1912, where he has the unfortunate designation of having to go up against Walter Johnson.
Oh man.
So he matches Johnson for 6 innings. He holds the Senators scoreless for 6 innings, but then he comes unraveled in the seventh. And this may have been the attitude problem they were talking about because he immediately blamed the defense for it.
Mm.
And it's been a while since you've played baseball, but I know from even playing men's league that
Don't do
there
that.
is always that guy who every time anything goes wrong, it's everybody else's fault. He could be this guy. We don't know for sure. But his baseball career mostly ends there. I think he plays in the minors for a couple more years. And he ends up enlisting in 1917 when World War I breaks out, and he serves as a sergeant in the 80th American Expeditionary Force Division. So back then, military units had way cooler names, like the American Expeditionary Force, and they were nicknamed the Blue Ridge Division, which is another great name.
Yeah.
So he serves in the Second Battle of the Somme, not the famous one. That was in 1916, and that was mostly the British. And San Mihil, I don't know if I pronounced that right. I apologize to the French. This is sort of like when we talked about the Japanese national team. The pronunciations, we're going to try. But he suffers a gunshot wound to the chest during the Argonne offensive, which ultimately took his life. So he was buried in France for a couple of years until his remains were moved back to his hometown of McDonald in 1921, where he receives a hero's welcome. His remains are basically paraded into town on like a cart drawn by like 4 black horses, I think. He gets a 21 gun salute. There's 1,000 members of his division there to welcome him home. And that is where he is buried today. So he's buried in McDonald, Pennsylvania. So that's Bun Troy. That's our first World War I guy.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not a World War One guy, but the Meuse-Argonne offensive was like the month before the war ended, right?
Yeah, that was basically like this is what the first time that the Americans are like a real force on their own. And they are they're finally like joined with the British and the French, and they make an offensive that turns the Western Front pretty much for good. In 1917, the Germans are actually winning because the Russians. I don't want to dovetail too much, but the Russian Revolution happens. The Russians
Yep.
leave the war, and the Germans are able to move all of their Eastern Front forces over to the West, and they start to win. And it is in part American forces starting to arrive that help them turn this back. And the Meuse-Argonne offensive is kind of when it's like, okay, it's looking like it might be over now. So yeah, it's like the end of the war. Again, American involvement is pretty much all the end of the war. But yeah, the Meuse-Argonne offensive is probably the most substantial American contribution in the war. So yeah, that's Bun Troy. He has one of the longer stories. A lot of these guys, there's not as much information, but there's a
Yeah.
couple more good ones, and then
Well, I
we'll
mean,
get into World War
obviously
II.
the players who were killed in combat are going to be a little longer than the guys who died of illness, just by
Hmm.
virtue of that being sort of a longer story that you have to tell.
Right.
Um,
So you want
but
to
yeah,
you
we
want to
can.
take the next guy?
Sure. So moving along in World War One, like I said, this isn't chronologically by the date of their death because
Right.
I
Yeah.
don't know that. But so moving along, we have Tom Burr, who was born in Chicago in 1893 to a wealthy family. He started as a pitcher at the Choate School, and then he enrolled at Williams College, but he
The
went pro
Randy Choate
before
School.
the Randy Choate School. But then
Yeah.
he enrolled at Williams College, but then went pro before he played any games for that school. He appeared in one MLB game for the Yankees on April 21st, 1914, playing center field, but he never received a plate appearance, and that was his only major league playing time. He
Hmm.
returned to Williams College, giving up a career in baseball. He returned to Williams College, and then he enlisted in the Army before he graduated in 1917. He attempted to become an officer, joining the 1st Officers Training Corps, but was discharged after contracting severe double pneumonia. I'm not sure what
Oh,
is double about the pneumonia, but it
it's
sounds
probably
pretty bad.
both lungs.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. So it was apparently bad enough they discharged him from the Army. He tried once again after he recovered to join the 1st Officers Training Corps to become an officer, but he was rejected now because of his age, so he can't catch a break.
Right.
So
Yeah.
Tom
This
Burr,
dude is just he zigs every time he should have zagged.
well,
You know.
he's aching to serve. So Tom
Right.
Burr, like I said, he came from a wealthy family. So the war is going on at this point. He had enlisted, and then they discharged him, and he couldn't serve anymore. So he financed his own trip to France to volunteer as an ambulance driver with the American Field Service before he enlisted in the American Aviation Corps. So he tried to become an officer, was medically discharged, tried again. Now he's rejected because of his age, and he's only 24 at this point. So I'm not sure what
Right.
that was all about, but I couldn't find any information on why. But so then he decided he was going to pay his own way to France, and he volunteered as an ambulance driver. So he had a heart of service. So good for him.
Yeah.
So
So
then
this
finally,
dude did like some World War I Rambo stuff where he was like, "I'm
exactly,
going out there whether you want me to or not."
exactly. So then after this happens, he's now in France. He finally is able to enlist in the American Aviation Corps. So um, airplanes, aviation is very, very new at this point. I suppose it's been
Hmm.
about 15 years since the airplane was invented. And it was a big part of World War One reconnaissance. There were a lot of fighter planes, things like that. So it was super, super new. And obviously, when something's really new, the technology isn't maybe to where you want it to be. And there were a lot of issues with flying planes. It was a very dangerous occupation to have, not like we know
Hmm.
today, where you fly very safely.
Right.
So he served as a pilot in the 31st Aero Squadron, and later he served as an instructor at the American Flying School in Issoudun, France. I hope I said that right.
Yeah.
Um,
Apologies to France again.
yeah. So while he was at the American Flying School, he was promoted to the rank of first lieutenant. So he finally became an officer, and he was given orders to report to the front. On October 12th, 1918, so 1 month before the war ends, a day after, Burr perished in a midair collision with another Newport biplane during a training
Oh,
exercise as both
oh,
planes were shooting at targets. So I think it was about 4,500 feet. They're both shooting at a stationary target, and they just collide. So both Burr and Lieutenant Kennedy were killed in the crash as both planes fell into the Cazo Lake. So both pilots, it was a single seat plane. Both pilots were killed, which is obviously unfortunate. 12 days
hmm.
later, so there was flaming wreckage that went down into the lake. They couldn't find much, and then 12 days later, one of the fuselages of the plane washed up, which is basically the body of the airplane.
Right. Yeah.
Burr's body was recovered, but Lieutenant Kennedy's never was. Initially, Burr was buried at the American Expeditionary Forces Cemetery number 29 in La Netous, France. Maybe it's La Netous, I'm not sure.
Again, apologies to France.
Yeah, if this were Spanish, I'd be doing a lot better. So he was initially interred in France at American Expeditionary Forces Cemetery number 29, but he was later reinterred at Rose Hill Cemetery and Mausoleum in his hometown of Chicago. Really fast, one of the things I thought was interesting about that was I kept reading this and I couldn't understand what was going on. It said that Burr and some of the other American graves there were deconsecrated. I don't really know what
Uh,
that
where
like it was
in
in France.
Chicago or in France?
No, in
Maybe
France.
just maybe just because there's nobody buried there anymore.
I sub I suppose so. So they basically were like unblessed, like by the church, which I thought was strange. But anyway, he was reinterred. Rose Hill Cemetery Mausoleum in Chicago. And I just think it's worth noting that he died 1 month before the war ended, as we saw
Right.
earlier with Bun Troy, which
Hmm.
I think makes it even sadder to me. So that was Tom Burr. What a hero, man. He kept trying and trying and trying to serve, and he finally did it, and
Yeah.
it cost him his life. And he was only 24 when he died, so he was younger than me.
Right. Again, World War I Rambo. This
Yeah.
dude was not taking no for an answer.
Yeah, absolutely.
He's like, you
Absolutely.
don't
So,
want me to serve, then
yeah.
I'm gonna go do it I'm gonna go freelance.
Yeah. I mean, when we think of the military, we think of, you know, a lot of guys being killed in action, but he was just as much of a hero, even though he never saw combat, as far as I know.
Hmm.
So that's
Yeah, I
Tom
mean,
Burr.
dude, listen, it's weird to say it's the thought that counts, but it kind of is, because again, this dude was told no, and he was like, I I reject that.
It
So
is. It is. Well, there's a saying in the military called the tooth to tail ratio, and basically the thinking of it is your tooth is the teeth of your forces you have on the front doing the shooting basically, and then the
right.
tail is the back part of your army that you have doing logistics work, supplies, things like that. And I don't remember off the top of my head, but I think it's a 5-to-1 ratio or 10-to-1 ratio or something like that.
Hmm.
You basically need a massive, massive amount of people in the back with the gear doing the things to be able to have the smaller amount of people do the actual fighting. So just
Right.
because somebody doesn't see combat doesn't mean they weren't an integral part of the American war machine, which I think is
Hmm.
worth noting. Do you want to move on to our next World War I guy?
Yeah. So the next guy we're gonna look at is a guy named Larry Chappell. Okay. Larry Chappell's born in McCluskey, Illinois, and he played again. This is another guy where his early life more or less just doesn't exist anymore. It's just lost to history. But he plays in several seasons of minor league ball, kind of bounce around before he gets picked up by the White Sox in 1913. So in 1913, he appears in 60 games. He's not like the world's best hitter, but he appears in 60 games. So he must have been doing something they liked, because he ends up being traded to the Indians, and he is the biggest bonus player to be traded for the Indians. I'm not like super clear on how the system worked back then, but I think the idea is that like back then teams would just purchase contracts from each other because players basically were just a commodity.
Mm-hmm.
So I believe he cost $18,000, which is a lot of money back then.
A king's
And
ransom back then, yeah.
yeah, and the player that he is part of the deal for is a little guy named Shoeless Joe Jackson.
Wow.
So he gets traded for Shoeless Joe, gets sent to the Indians. He only appears in 3 games for the Indians before he is purchased by the Braves, where he plays his final 2 seasons. And this, unfortunately, is with limited success. Again, a lot of these guys are a little fringy. He returns to minor league ball, and he has his best season as a professional player. He hits 325 for the Salt Lake City Bees. So that's his final season. He joins the U.S. Army Medical Corps in 1917. But unfortunately, one of the biggest pandemics of all time, the Spanish flu, strikes Larry Chappell. He contracts Spanish flu working for the Medical Corps, and he dies soon afterwards. So that is unfortunate. Again, a lot of these guys are going to die of disease. Disease is the biggest killer in almost every war. It's a little known thing, but especially in World War I, because Spanish flu is right there afterwards and concurrently. But he is buried currently in Jerseyville, Illinois. So that's Larry Chappell.
Yeah. Well, we can stick with the theme of the Spanish flu if you'd like. I can go on to my next guy.
Yes. So why don't we do your next guy?
Sure. So the next player is Harry Chapman. This he was really hard to find information on, so apologies if this one's going to be short. But I do just want to point out again, baseball's greatest sacrifice. There's also a website called Baseball in Wartime that I used, and the Saber Bio
Mm-hmm.
project was a massive help. So all those resources were excellent. So thank you to everyone involved there. So Harry Chapman, he was born in Severance, Kansas on October 26th, 1885. He made his major league debut at the age of 26 for the Chicago Cubs on October 6th, 1912. So actually just before his 27th birthday. He
That's kind of
appeared
a
in
late debut, isn't it?
it is a late debut, but a lot of these guys were one gamers or a couple gamers. Harry
Mm-hmm.
Chapman appeared in 147 total big league games over 5 seasons. He slashed 198, 269, 250 across 460 plate appearances with 8 doubles, 5 triples, and 1 home run. So not much of a hitter. He was a catcher.
Right.
Not much of a hitter, but he was a big leaguer for a couple of seasons.
Yeah. Well, back
Um,
then, I mean, this is even still true nowadays, but especially back then, catchers were just not expected to hit.
no,
Like,
no.
it just wasn't part of their job description, which is what made dudes like Mickey Cochran so, so notable.
Yeah, Bill Dickey, those kind of guys.
Yeah,
Yogi Berra.
guys who were catchers and also hit were an incredible rarity back then. So that's probably why he stuck around as long as he did.
Yeah. Yogi Berra, by the way, another guy who was wounded in World War II. He served at D-Day. So anyway, back to Harry Chapman. His career ended in 1917, and he entered the Army later that year. I couldn't find what he did in the Army or what unit he was with, which is unfortunate. But he died 5 days before his 33rd birthday on October 21st, 1918. So again, just before the end of the war, a couple of weeks, at State Hospital number 3 in Nevada, Missouri, from influenza-induced pneumonia. And like you said, the Spanish flu was going around. That's what it was. He's buried at McPherson Cemetery in McPherson, Kansas. So that's all I could find on Harry Chapman. Like you said, it's a shame. He died in the United States. He just died from illness. Which, yeah, like you said, is a definitely something that happens a lot in wartime, and it's a very new phenomenon that we don't have a lot of people dying from disease in wartime, but also just in the world at large. Like, I think malaria is the largest killer of human beings of all time, right? Something like that.
I mean, I don't know for a fact, but that's a believable fact.
Yeah. Like, people used to just die of illness all the time, and it's probably over the past less than 100 years that it's become manageable.
Right, and part of the reason why this is rare in war now is literally because, like, most of your casualties in war would come from people dying from disease. And, armies figured out, like, oh, well, if we do better sanitation, if we have better medical treatment for these guys, then, these guys aren't just going to die waiting for battles to start. They're not going to die from minor injuries as much.
And like trips aren't as gruel, like, because, like, up until the invention of, like, I guess trains, but mostly like cars and airplanes, like, you just have to walk everywhere to get somewhere and, like, wear yourself out. Now you don't have that issue. And I think like one of the huge innovations of the Civil War was canned food, like processed preserved food, because you could basically feed an army on the move kind of indefinitely, whereas before that you had to sort of live off the land and like forage for food, and so in the Civil War you could sort of send anybody anywhere and bring food with them. So yeah, there are a lot of things that we take for granted now that were huge killers throughout human history, and illness is one of them. So
and that's going to be a theme.
Yeah, well, why don't you move on to your next guy? I'm done with World War I, so you finish out.
So the next guy I have, this might be the one that I think is, as a baseball fan, the saddest. This guy's name is Ralph Sharman, and he was born in Cleveland, Ohio, and he begins his minor league career at the age of 20 with the Portsmouth Cobblers. Again, another guy, we don't know anything about him until he starts playing professional baseball.
Fantastic name, by the way. The Cobblers.
The Portsmouth Cobblers, yeah.
Was this guy Jewish, by the way?
That does sound like a Jewish name, Sharman.
I'm going to look it up. I think I remember hearing that. Go ahead.
Throw him on Team Israel? Probably not, but maybe if things had gone differently, because he hits .397 with 5 home runs in 393 at-bats for the Cobblers, which 5 home runs in, I don't have the year he started, but this is the dead ball era. More than 1 home run is impressive. So, this dude, as you might expect, he's a great hitter. He rises quickly through the minors. I think he has 1 year where he kind of falls down on the job, but he bounces back pretty quickly. So he gets signed by the Philadelphia A's in 1917, and he plays 13 games for them, batting .327. And by all indications, it really seems like this dude has a bright future. I believe he's 23 when he is signed. And again, this dude bats high 300s. He has a lot of power for the time. This dude looks like he's going to be a great player. But unfortunately, 1917 happens to be the year that World War I becomes a thing for the United States. So he enlists in the United States Army. I believe he was an artilleryman, which World War I is the first war with modern artillery. So this is the first war where the United States in particular is really taking artillery seriously as like a war winner. So he gets into a pretty important branch, but unfortunately, he drowns in the Alabama River during his training. So that is the end of both his life and, what really looked like a promising career. He was 23 when he died. So again, really young guy, and he is buried in Cincinnati. So that's Ralph Sharman. He's kind of the biggest, in my opinion, what could have been story here, because he
Yeah.
really seems like he was a great hitter. And the A's, at the time are arguably the best organization in the game. So, you're
Yeah.
looking at a guy who, we would have seen him through the live ball era, and there's really no telling what he could have done. So he's sort of again, a what if story.
Yeah.
But
I
that's
will
Ralph
correct
Sharman,
myself. I looked him up, not Jewish, sorry.
not Jewish. Oh well,
That is really sad though. That's one of those like what a waste, you know.
I know, yeah, and they're all what a waste. But
Well, yeah,
but this is one where, as a baseball fan, you really want to see what he could have done.
absolutely,
Um,
yeah.
yeah. So the next guy is a guy named Newt Halliday. It's a great name. Again, this is old time baseball. People are going to have wild names like this. Newt was born in Chicago, Illinois in 1896. And this is another guy who there's just little information about. But the difference here is the only thing Baseball Reference shows is that he had one at bat in a game for the Pirates in 1916, where he struck out for a cool negative 100 OPS plus.
Yikes.
But what I thought was weird about Newt Halliday was that there's no record of him playing in the minors or anything. I would assume he must have played indie ball or college ball or something, but I couldn't find anything about it. So as far as we know, he only had one at bat for the Pirates. Again, he struck out. And what I wrote here was it appears to be lost to history how much potential he may have had, and he never had the chance to find that out himself, as he enlisted in the U.S. Navy in 1917. So during his training in the Navy, he would contract tuberculosis, and he would pass away on April 6, 1918. So he's buried in River Grove, Illinois now. Um, and this is another one where tuberculosis was a huge killer at the time. A lot of people might know it by its colloquial name, consumption. If you ever read anything by Edgar Allan Poe, he talks about it all the time because he knew a lot of people who died from tuberculosis, and everybody did at the time. So it's another story of, a guy who it arguably was just born at the wrong time. Spanish flu, tuberculosis, all these things are just going around, and there's a lot of people are not going to make it because of tuberculosis. So that's Newt Halliday. He is the one with the least information about him, but another guy who died serving the country, so he deserves as much honor as everybody else does. The next guy is my favorite of these guys. This guy's name is Eddie Grant, who some of you may have heard of. He's probably the best known of these World War I guys. Eddie Grant was born in 1883 in Franklin, Massachusetts, and he got his first taste of baseball playing for his college team at Harvard University, where he simultaneously pursued and graduated with a law degree in 1909. Now, it says he got his undergrad in 05 and then his law degree in 09. And the reason that I think it took more time is because he made his MLB debut in 1905. So I'm guessing he was kind of juggling those two things. He's another guy with a connection to a Hall of Famer because he made his debut as an emergency replacement for a guy named Nap Lajoie, or Nap Lahoy, depending on how you want to pronounce it.
Right.
He was suffering from a spike wound. So Nap Lahoy got spiked, and the dye in his sock seeped into the wound and infected the wound so badly that he had to show up to games in a wheelchair because he couldn't walk anymore.
Oh, whoa.
So at
What
this
an
point, he was
old-time baseball injury, too.
I know. This is evidently why when players wore stockings, they had to have the white sock and then the colored one over it. So there is a
Oh,
rule for that.
interesting.
Um, so he only played 65 games, and Eddie Grant was brought in to be his backup, and he became known as Harvard Eddie, which is because he went to Harvard. And he was known that I like this. This is my favorite Eddie Grant fact. He was known for refusing to say "I got it" for a pop up because it was grammatically incorrect, and he would instead say "I have it." I love that. That's such grammar nerd stuff.
That's like something my mom would do.
I know, yeah. Like that's my favorite Eddie
Now,
Grant fact.
I'm thinking about it. Couldn't he say, "I've got it"?
He could, but maybe "got it" is not grammatically correct. I mean, people were
Also,
big sticklers back then.
I really like. It's not like it's like, oh, get it or Harvard Eddie, that English teacher. Like he's a lawyer. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
He's just being a nerd.
yeah. This guy was like arguably the biggest nerd in baseball history.
Oh, that's
So
hilarious.
so he has his law degree. He will not say "I got it" because it's grammatically incorrect. He says "I have it" instead. And you know what? You can't give him a hard time about it because evidently he was reputed as an excellent fielder and a good base stealer. And he
So
would
he
go on to
frequently had it.
yes, that's true. Yeah, he would frequently have cause to say "I have it." He would go on to serve as the starting third baseman for the Reds and the Phillies for 4 seasons. And at the time, this is kind of an arcane thing to mention, but at the time, your third baseman was almost always basically just like, oh, this guy is a shortstop, but we have another guy who's a little bit better than him. So he plays more like a shortstop, essentially. He's not a great bat, but he's a great fielder and he's fast. So that's Eddie Grant's skill set. Later in his career, the fact that he doesn't hit that well starts to kind of set in, and he becomes more of a utility man for his last 2 or 3 seasons. After retiring in 1915, our boy Harvard Eddie opened his own law practice. So this dude's a Renaissance man.
Yeah, he's a very accomplished individual.
And he works there, being a lawyer until World War One begins for the United States again in 1917. And he is one of the earliest men to enlist in the war. So he ultimately, I think he finishes with the rank of captain. And his most famous story, and this is unfortunately the end of his story as well, his unit loses all of the officers who are superior to him. So he takes command of the whole unit, and he commands them during their search for the famous Lost Battalion in the Argonne Forest. Short version of what the Lost Battalion is, they are a American battalion that advances too far into German lines and ends up getting surrounded, and they become kind of this it's not really a lost cause story because in the end about half of them, I think maybe a third, do make it out, but they get surrounded and they basically are under siege from the Germans for like 6 days. And the Americans are doing everything they can to try to get these guys supplies, to try to get them more ammunition, all that type of stuff. And it's just not working out. So they did eventually get rescued after 6 days, but only about a third of them made it out. I think it was about 450 men, and like 150 of them died. Another 150, 160 surrendered, and then the last 150 did make it out. But unfortunately, during the search for the Lost Battalion, Grant's unit comes under fire from German artillery, and he is killed by an exploding shell in the Argonne Forest. So he is buried in Lorraine, France, at the Meuse-Argonne American Cemetery. So thus ends the story of Eddie Grant, a true Renaissance man.
Yeah.
Harvard Eddie would not say "I got it," and went out like a champ. So,
and another guy who died right before the end of the war, right?
yeah. I mean, pretty much all of these guys die right before the end of the war again, because the American involvement comes right before the end of the war. But the last guy I have, this is our final World War I name, is a guy named Harry Glenn. And Harry Glenn is born in 1890 in Shelburne, Indiana. And yet again, I mean, broken record here, but we don't really know anything about him until he begins his minor league career in 1910. And he is a lefty hitting catcher. So he plays for 5 years in the minors. And he performs well enough that in 1915, the Cardinals bring him up to serve as a backup catcher for them. So in this role, he only gets 16 at bats. He gets 5 hits, so he bats .313. he acquits himself well. He did okay, for what they brought him up to do. But unfortunately, he would not return to the majors after that year. He played a couple of more minor league seasons before enlisting in the U.S. Army Signal Corps in 1918, where he settled in as an aviation mechanic. But unfortunately, during his service, he contracted a cold, which eventually intensified into pneumonia, and that took his life in October of that year. So another guy who just right before the finish line. And he is buried in, I'm going to try, Terre Haute, Indiana.
Oh, Terre Haute, yeah. You got
Terre
it.
Haute. There you go. So, that's Harry Glenn. A little bit less than Eddie Grant. Eddie Grant is the biggest story of these World War I guys, but, no less respectable a career of service. So that
Absolutely.
ends World War I. And now we're going to get into some stuff that, is things that are more in the American, cultural
Well, there is
memory.
one more guy. Before we move on to World War II, there's one more guy. This one's interesting. His name is Marvin Goodwin, although his Sabre bio was listed under Marv Goodwin. So if you're looking him up,
right,
he's on Baseball References, Marv Goodwin. Marvin
Goodwin is a great, sitcom character name.
I feel like that guy's smart. You know what I mean? Like Marvin Goodwin, he wears glasses. You know what I mean? He's really smart.
I believe it.
You could pay him to take the test for you.
Sort of an Eddie Grant type,
Yeah. We're making all these things up, by the way. I have no idea about Marvin Goodwin's intelligence.
Right, yeah.
So Marvin Goodwin, he was born on January 16th, 1891 in Gordonsville, Virginia. Growing up, he made a name for himself with a blazing fastball and an excellent spitball. And he was actually one of 17 players who was allowed to use the spitter after MLB grandfathered them in after their ban on the spitball.
Mm-hmm.
So that's interesting. I always thought it was a lot more players than that, but it's only 17 players that were allowed to continue using it throughout their career, and he was one of them. So Goodwin pitched in 102 career games, starting 40 of them. He compiled a 3.30 ERA across 447 and a third innings for a 91 ERA plus. So decent, nothing special, but he was decent.
Yeah.
He enlisted in the U.S. Army Air Corps in December 1917. And he trained as a pilot in San Antonio and served as an instructor throughout World War I. So he didn't see combat, but he was a flying instructor during World War I. He made it through World War I.
Tail guy,
Yeah, he made it through World War I unscathed. He returned to MLB for the 1919 through the 1922 season. So he saw action all this. So he played in MLB before World War I. Then he enlisted. Then after World War I, he went back to it. And then after a couple of years off, he got back to the big leagues in 1925 at the age of 34. And actually, he had a pretty good 1925 season, and he was looking forward to pitching again in 1926. So his career was not over. He remained, however, in the Army Air Service Reserve after the end of World War I. So he basically was a reservist after World War I for the following 7 years, I suppose. So he continued to be a part of the military. On October 18th, 1925, Marvin Goodwin flew a Curtiss JN-6H Jenny biplane from Ellington Field in Houston as part of the 111th Observation Squadron 36th Division. So he's on a training flight in Houston. And as he's attempting to land, the plane enters a tailspin at 200 feet. And only Goodwin's excellent piloting skills saved the life and his mechanic, Staff Sergeant W.H. McGrath. So there's two guys in the plane. He's flying. Everything's going well. They're attempting to land at 200 feet, so really, really close to the ground when you're flying. And the plane enters a tailspin. It's really bad situation, and only through Marvin Goodwin's excellent flying was he able to put the plane down at all. So apparently, otherwise, they would have been killed instantly. But he was able to save his own life and also the Staff Sergeant W.H. McGrath. So McGrath escaped with only minor injuries, just bruising, basically. And Goodwin suffered multiple fractures to all four limbs, as well as a fracture at the base of the skull. So he's in bad shape. Yeah. So he was able to successfully land the plane, save the life of the other man, but he obviously wasn't able to walk away from it. So he did survive the landing, and he was sent to a hospital. After initially seeming to recover, First Lieutenant Goodwin passed away at 5:05 a.m. on October 21st, 1925 at Baptist Hospital in Houston. So he survived for another 3 days. And he was the only major leaguer to die while serving, not in wartime, which I thought was interesting. So Marvin Goodwin, I think it's amazing. He pitched in the big leagues, went and served in World War I, came back, pitched in the big leagues, had a lengthy career. He pitched through his 30s. He was looking forward to pitching more. And then he saved somebody's life during a training accident, and he ultimately died. So another guy didn't make a lot of headlines, not a super splashy name, but a hero
Right.
nonetheless. So
Well,
that's Marvin.
he has the longest career of anybody so far, right?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I didn't look
Okay.
at it off the top of my head, but yeah, probably. So Marvin Goodwin, solid ball player and a hero. So it's a shame what happened to him. All right, so we moved through World War One. We did another guy in peacetime. Now we're moving on to World War Two. So the first man up is Elmer Gedeon. Elmer
Right.
Gedeon was quite the athlete. He lettered
Right.
in football, baseball, and track and field at the University of Michigan. And he passed up a chance to make the Olympic track team in 1940 to pursue a career in baseball. So quite a gifted athlete. He
Okay.
also was
Yeah.
the nephew of a guy named Joe Gedeon who played in Major League Baseball in his own right. And he was part of a gambling scandal where I don't know if he was
Mhm.
accused of fixing games or he just was betting on games that he was a part of, but he got like blacklisted from Major League Baseball. So he
Oh,
kind of got the
good.
same, yeah, he kind of got the same treatment as the Black Sox. So that's interesting.
Right.
But so he comes from a baseball family. He was quite an athlete. So at 22 years old, Gedeon played in 5 games for the 1939 Washington Senators, collecting 5 hits across 15 at bats. So 333 batting average, only 15 at bats though. Unfortunately,
Still.
yeah, unfortunately, his big league career would be a short one, as he spent the 1940 season in the minors before being drafted into the Army in January 1941. So I thought that was interesting. He was drafted prior to the U.S. involvement in World War II. So he, I guess, was sort of just stuck in the military once World War II happened. So
Hmm.
not to say he didn't want to be there or anything. I don't know that, but I just thought it was interesting that he was involved even before they got into the war. So Elmer Gedeon, oh, this one's going to be a little bit longer one, by the way. He's a super interesting guy. Hope that's all right.
That's okay. Yeah.
So Elmer Gedeon trained as a navigator in twin-engine bombers when his life changed on August 9th, 1942. The B-25 Mitchell, which was a medium bomber that he was flying in, crashed into a swamp immediately after takeoff. So literally right into the swamp.
Right.
And it immediately killed 2 crew members and injured the others. Gedeon sustained 3 broken ribs as well as burns to his back, hands, face, and legs, but managed
Oh.
to crawl his way to safety. So he's in a crash. He's in bad shape. He broke some ribs. He suffered severe burns all over his body, and he gets out of the burning wreckage and he crawls his way to safety. Quite an ordeal. However, after making his way out, Gedeon went back into the burning wreckage to rescue Corporal John R. Rarrett, who had broken his back and 2 legs in the crash. So Gedeon's in bad shape and he goes back in to save somebody else. He does save this guy's life, Corporal John R. Rarrett, and he suffers burns because of this. So ultimately, First Lieutenant Gedeon needed 3 months in the hospital to recover from his injuries, requiring skin grafts to heal his burns. So he's in bad shape.
Right. Yeah. This
This
guy's not doing good at this point in time.
yeah. So this wasn't these injuries weren't due to being in combat with the enemy, so he wasn't eligible for the normal valor awards that you would expect, like the Medal of Honor, the Distinguished Service
Right.
Cross, even a Purple Heart. But he was awarded the Soldier's Medal in honor of his heroic actions that day, which I've come to realize is sort of like the next best thing that you can get, basically, that isn't because of combat. So that's interesting.
Right. It's
So
sort of like
Gedeon,
the non-combat Medal of Honor.
right, I guess so, yeah.
Yeah.
So Gedeon believed that fortune would smile upon him for the rest of his military service, telling his cousin, I had my accident. It's going to be good flying from now on.
He probably shouldn't have said that, huh?
Yeah, he probably shouldn't have.
Well.
Unfortunately, he wouldn't be so lucky after seeing combat. On April 20th, 1944, now Captain Elmer Gedeon took off from England in a B-26 Marauder, another medium bomber, in a bombing run over northern France. So this is in the lead up to D-Day, heavy bombing campaigns over occupied France. So the
Right.
bomber group came under heavy anti-aircraft fire at night, with Gedeon's plane being struck below the cockpit after dropping their payload. So that's bad news. The plane's
Right.
co-pilot was able to bail out with his clothes on fire. He was able to jump out and pull the ripcord, but Captain Gedeon and 5 others perished in the crash. So they died in France, but they were able to carry out their mission. So Captain Elmer Gedeon was initially laid to rest alongside British service members in a small cemetery in Saint Paul, France, but was later
Yeah.
reinterred at Arlington National Cemetery. Gedeon was awarded the Soldier's Medal earlier for his training accident and the Air Medal for valor, as well as a Purple Heart for his wounds inflicted by the enemy. Gedeon and Harry O'Neill were the only 2 MLB players out of more than 500 that served during World War II to be killed during the war. So what a hero.
Yeah.
He already has one heroic instance. He saves somebody's life, and then he goes on to be killed in combat, which is a shame. And I forget
Right.
exactly how old he was when he died, but I think he was like 25.
So this
Um,
is probably the most decorated guy we're talking about today, right?
Probably. I didn't think to look it up, but probably, yeah.
He
Um,
he seems like he's got the strongest case right now. Let's
yeah,
put it that way.
it
You know.
sounds like it, yeah. So moving on, so we're on to the other player who died during World War II, Harry O'Neill. He's actually a local guy to us. He's a Philadelphia native.
There you go.
Harry O'Neill had quite a distinguished collegiate career, leading Gettysburg College to league championships in baseball, football, and basketball. So another three-sport athlete. After
Hmm.
school, O'Neill signed with the Philadelphia Athletics, appearing in one game as a catcher during the 1939 season, failing to record a plate appearance. That would prove to be his only big league contest, as O'Neill bounced around from minor league baseball to semi-pro football and basketball in the following years. So he ends up deciding not to pursue a career in baseball, tries other sports, bounces around. And then in 1942, Harry O'Neill enlists in the United States Marines, serving as a first lieutenant in Weapons Company, 25th Marine Regiment, 4th Marine Division. He shipped out to the Pacific, seeing combat on both Saipan and Tinian, which were part of MacArthur's island hopping campaign. And I
Yeah,
think
those are both islands in the Pacific Ocean, for those of you
yeah.
who don't know.
So really quick,
Otherwise, not remarkable, but
yeah, yeah.
yeah,
So really quick, just to explain that, because I realize we might be confusing people.
right.
Basically, during World War II, in Europe, it's a pretty simple process. There's a lot of land in Europe that the Germans have taken over. You're attempting to get it back, basically, in very broad strokes. You're just trying to beat the enemy and get everything back to
Well,
normal.
it's a very
In the
traditional type of war over there.
right,
It's a land war.
right. In the Pacific theater, it's not as simple because it's mostly ocean in the South Pacific. There was fighting in India and things like that, China,
Yeah, Burma.
but
Yeah.
right in China and things like that. But as far as the United States is concerned, it was pretty much all in the ocean. So obviously the Navy had a heavy involvement, but Douglas MacArthur, who was in overall command of the Pacific theater, was of the impression that we should work our way up to the islands of Japan, which is in the north of the Pacific. And so he basically started in Australia and said, we're going to move our way up, taking island by island, establishing airfields there, and then we'll use our naval power to move upwards, and we'll keep establishing air bases on every island so that we can bomb the next island and keep moving our way up. Eventually, we'll be in range of the Japanese mainland, which worked. And basically, the last one they
Hmm.
needed to get was Okinawa, to be able to land B-29 super fortresses, which were like the greatest bomber of the day. And then they could take off from Okinawa and bomb Japan. So it did work. It forced Japan's capitulation. And they ultimately were able to use that to drop the atomic bomb on Japan and win the war. But one of the things that's important to note is during World War II, the fighting in the Pacific was really, really intense compared to the European theater in North Africa and things like that.
Hmm.
Obviously, I wouldn't want to be in combat in either of them, but the Pacific was brutal. The Japanese were basically just a brutal opponent, and they would torture prisoners of war. They would rape and kill the civilian population of these islands. And they were sort of, I'm speaking in generalities here, but for the most part, they were fanatical and they weren't going to surrender.
Right.
So when you got onto these Pacific islands, you had to fight for every single yard, and you essentially had to kill pretty much every defender because they weren't willing to be captured. There were exceptions
Right.
to that, but for the most part, you're going to have to kill everyone. And there were things like, they would get wounded, and then when an American or an allied, medic would go to try and help them, they would explode a grenade, things like that. So there were a lot of dangers that you might not have to deal with in the European theater that you would have to deal with
Right.
in the
Well,
Pacific.
another
So it was,
thing is
yeah,
that
go ahead.
like everybody knows about D-Day. And amphibious landings at the time are the most difficult thing to do. World War One is the first time where it's even possible, and every single island mission, every single battle, and during this island campaign, you have to do a D-Day. And
Yeah,
depending on how well garrisoned the island is, if it's somewhere like Iwo Jima or Okinawa, it's going to be absolutely just a bloodbath.
yeah,
And I believe Tinian was one of the ones that was also well garrisoned. So he's
yeah.
seeing combat in absolutely ruthless theaters.
Yeah, Tinian and Saipan are both absolute slugfests, and so Harry O'Neill is an officer, and so he's in. I didn't find out, but he's in a leadership position basically.
Hmm.
of weapons company, and so he's seeing heavy combat. So he's jumping from island to island, and he's moving forward with the American forces. So he ships out to the Pacific. He sees combat on both Saipan and Tinian, enduring a shrapnel wound to the shoulder in the latter engagement on June 16th, 1944. So on Tinian, he's wounded by the enemy. The following year, O'Neill and the 4th Marine Division took part in the harrowing Battle of Iwo Jima, like you mentioned, Tom, another
Hmm.
brutal one. And basically, just to give like a little bit of background on that, Iwo Jima was, I don't want to say very well garrisoned, but they had thousands of Japanese soldiers there.
It's heavily
Um,
fortified.
Heavily fortified, and they had it's like a mountainous island, and so they had a network of tunnels that went all through the island. And so basically, the Americans land, they encounter not the craziest resistance at the beginning, and then as they move inward, the Japanese are moving all over the island kind of simultaneously because they have this tunnel system, and they're moving
Hmm.
all over all the time, popping out, shooting at you, going back in. And it was like, I think,
Right.
well over a month that they had to do this every single day and just grind it out and keep fighting and fighting
Right.
and fighting. So
Yeah,
it
it
was a
becomes clear
brutal.
very early that they're going to have to root out the Japanese resistance by going into these
Yeah,
tunnels,
yeah,
which is just not something you want to be involved in.
yeah,
This is a
yeah,
type
and
of
that's
warfare that nobody is familiar with.
yeah,
It is just man to man, just it's a slaughter fest at the
it's
end of the
awful.
day.
It's
Iwo
awful,
Jima is one of
and
the worst battles of the war.
it's horrible. And when you think about these things, like you said with D-Day, one of the big important parts that you want to do is a bombardment beforehand. You want to try and soften up their defenses, basically, and you
Right,
want to
yeah.
have your warships just sit there and just pound away and pound away and pound away. And sometimes that's effective, and sometimes that's not. But the whole idea is you just fire and fire and fire and try and kill as many of the enemy as you can to make it easier when you land. The problem is on Iwo Jima, they're all underground. So you can fire as long as you want. They're just going to sit in a mountain, and it's not going to
Right.
really bother them very much.
Yeah.
And if you ever watch the movie Letters from Iwo Jima, it does a really good job of showing you how this worked. It's a Clint Eastwood movie. It's really good.
Hmm.
This was not enjoyable for the Japanese either. Like, this was a
Yeah.
horrible existence of living off barely any rations, getting sick, things like that. So it's horrible for both sides, everyone involved. It's awful. And a lot of Americans get killed during Iwo Jima. So he takes part in Iwo Jima, one of the bloodiest battles of the war. He's leading men into battle. So on March 6, 1945, so close to the end of the war, about 2 months before the end of the war, First Lieutenant Harry O'Neill was killed by a sniper while attacking Japanese positions. He was one of 6,102 United States Marines killed during the 5-week battle. That's unbelievable to me. Over a 5-week span,
Mm.
6,100 people, 6,100 just Americans get killed. Not to, I think it was
Right.
21,000 casualties in total. So that means
Yeah, I was going to say
captured,
that's
wounded.
just killed too.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Uh-huh.
So that means there's what, I guess 17,000 more captured, wounded, and missing. So it's just an
Right.
awful, it's just an awful place to be.
And I
And that wasn't the
believe
end
the
of the.
casualty rate for the Japanese is close to, if not 100%. So
Yeah,
this is
I think there were a
like,
small amount of captured and then
yeah,
mostly killed.
it's
So it was,
difficult to imagine how brutal this sort of warfare is.
yeah, this would be horrible. And it wasn't even the end of the war is the worst part, because then they had to go take Okinawa, which was another absolute slugfest. And that had its own
Hmm.
issues because there was a significant civilian population in Okinawa that was being mistreated by the Japanese. And to go on a little bit of a rabbit trail, just because I think it's important to note, the Japanese were basically telling the Okinawan civilians that don't let the Americans capture you, they'll kill you, they'll rape your children. And
Right.
so a lot of the civilians on Okinawa killed themselves and their family rather than let the Americans capture them.
Hmm.
And the worst part is the Americans were going to come and liberate them and let them not be under Japanese rule, which was horrific. So the
Right.
whole thing was
It's
backwards. It was really sad. It was terrible. And Harry O'Neill was killed on Iwo Jima trying to end this, basically. So Harry O'Neill is one of 6,102 Marines that are killed during Iwo Jima. He was only 27 years old, and he left behind a wife, Ethel. And he's buried in Arlington Cemetery in Drexel Hill, Pennsylvania, which I drive past all the time. So I should
right.
probably stop by and see Harry O'Neill's grave. There's actually a lot of major leaguers that are buried there, believe it or not. So that's Harry O'Neill, hero. I don't know what else to say. It's
Yeah. Yeah,
um,
it turns into a little bit of a downer to talk about stuff like this because, like we've said multiple times now, like especially like Pacific theater warfare, like if you talk about it and you don't think about it, you can kind of get through it. But if you talk about it and you start thinking about what you're saying, all of a sudden it turns into like, oh man, like
it
jeez.
it is sad, but I think it's important to note because it's
Well, it is, yeah.
these are things that people had to do to basically let us live the lives that we do that in basically
Right.
luxury. You know what I mean? Nobody shot at me. I don't think anybody ever will shoot at me. I've never had to shoot at someone else.
Right.
And that's kind of a remarkable achievement that
Mm-hmm.
we're living lives where we don't even have to think about these issues. Like now we worry about money and stuff like that.
Right.
And other people had to die to basically to do this. So I think it's important
Mm-hmm. Well,
that we
that's what
remember that.
that's what Memorial Day is about. That's why
Exactly.
we have a holiday for this sort of thing.
Exactly. Yeah. And there's a famous quote. I think it's been ascribed to a lot of different people, but it's the whole idea of people come back, they see horrible things in wartime, and they come back and they go, "I'm not a hero. The heroes are the guys that didn't come back." And that's basically like the important part is like, we can do a Veterans Day episode and talk about all the people that did amazing things like Bob Feller and Warren Spahn and Ted Williams who saw combat and did these amazing things and came back and talked about it. I think it's important that we do the talking for these people that can't. So
Right.
I guess that's why we want to do it. So there's one more guy. We're done with World War II, sort of, but we're done with the World War II casualties. I'll put it that way.
Right.
So the last man is named Bob Neighbors. Oklahoman Bob Neighbors was a grinder through and through, is what I wrote. Earning
Oh
a big
man,
league. Yeah,
little David Eckstein type.
yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Oklahoman Bob Neighbors was a grinder through and through, earning a big league call up with the St. Louis Browns in September 1937, but didn't appear in a game. So that's a bummer. He works
Yeah.
through the minor leagues, makes his way up to the majors, and then doesn't get to play. He guts out another minor league season in 1938 and receives another call up in 1939, making his major league debut on September 16th. So he finally gets there. The shortstop collected 2 hits in 7 games with the Browns in his only big league action. So it wasn't a long one, but he had a big league career.
Right.
This is a little bit of a longer entry, by the way, just to let you know.
Well,
Neighbors
it's World
plugged
War II. I
away.
mean, there's just better records of people
Yeah,
in
exactly.
the 40s than there
It's
is
more
in
modern.
the 1880.
He also had a lengthy military career, which I'm sure helped
Okay.
historians. Neighbors plugged away in the minor leagues during the next 2 seasons, but tragedy struck in the summer of 1941. While Bob Neighbors was on a road trip, his wife Winifred died after being hit by a car. The couple had
Oh,
been married for less than a year. So already before the military is involved, he's going through it. So
right.
now, during World War II, Bob Neighbors answered his country's call, serving in the Army Air Forces with the 22nd Air Transport Training Department. Neighbors deployed to both Europe and the Pacific over the course of the war, earning a reputation as a stellar pilot. While Bob Neighbors made it through the war unscathed, the same couldn't be said for his brothers. Morris Neighbors sustained multiple wounds on his ship. These are his brothers, by the way.
Right. Yeah.
Morris Neighbors sustained multiple wounds when his ship, the USS Leutze, I'm not sure, Leutze. Morris
That
Neighbors
sounds like
sustained,
Loitza.
yeah, Lutz, maybe, I'm not sure. Morris Neighbors sustained multiple wounds when his ship, the USS Leutze, was hit by a kamikaze off the coast of Okinawa on April 6, 1945. So that's another thing, going back to the Japanese way of waging war during World War II. I'm sure most people
Right.
are familiar with this, but just in case, the kamikaze program was enacted towards the end of the war when Japan was basically desperate to try and win, and they just couldn't.
Right.
They basically said, look, we're out of trained fighter pilots for the most part. We're not making any headway. We're losing all this ground. We're going to try anything. So they basically had human bombs. They would put a pilot, they would give him like a week of training, I think 3 days on how to take off, 3 days on how to fly, and then 1 day on how to
Yeah.
crash into a plane.
Yeah.
So it's
Notably 0 days on how to land.
right, 0
Yeah.
days on how to land.
Not
So they would
important.
take these young recruits, they'd put them in a plane. I think they put a 500-pound bomb in the bomb bay. Or I guess it didn't have a bomb bay because it was a fighter plane, but whatever. They would equip it with a 500-pound bomb, and then they'd have you fly towards the American positions. And the Americans are really, really close to the Japanese mainland at this point, and they'd have you pick out a target and just fly into it, and you would die, and you would
Right.
attempt to take out an entire ship. And so their whole thinking was, if we could trade one man and one plane for an entire ship, we can kill a lot of Americans and hopefully break their will to fight and not win the war, but have them give us agreeable
Right.
terms to surrender and be able to keep some of our possessions in the Pacific. It didn't work. The Americans
Right.
really did not like this, and they ended up dropping the atomic bomb, and Japan ended up capitulating. But that's
Yeah,
just
it
another
ended up sort of having the opposite effect, and it
right,
kind of like
right,
hardened the American resolve.
right. But it's just another horrific thing that happened during World War II, a war full of horrific things, as we know.
Right.
And I just can't even imagine, like, it's one thing to fight someone who's trying to shoot you. I can't even imagine what it would be like trying to fight someone who wants to die to kill you. Like, that's
Right.
amazing to me. And we actually, side note, we both worked for a couple of years at the Pennsylvania Veterans Museum and Media, which you should check out. It's a really cool place.
Yeah,
I think they're open Friday through Sunday,
that
12
sounds
to
right.
12 to 5. So you should go check it out if you can. It's underneath the Trader Joe's. But one of the
Mhm.
guys there, I think he's the chairman of the board. His name's Ed Buffman, and he was a World War II. Actually, I think he's still alive, as far as I know. I think he's
Yeah, I
96 or
haven't heard
97 at this
anything
point. Yeah,
to the
spry, really
contrary.
spry. Ed Buffman was always out doing things, so good on him. But
Yeah,
Ed Buffman served on the USS Missouri, as we know from Ed's teachings, the ship that won the war, which is
right,
the ship that President Truman signed the surrender documents from Japan on, and it was
right.
the ship that they ended the war on.
Hmm.
But he would tell stories of how he stared down the barrel at a kamikaze, basically, of how there were kamikazes that tried to attack the Missouri, and he was on an anti-aircraft gun shooting at them. So that
Hmm.
was remarkable to me when I was growing up. And
Right.
so Bob Neighbors' brother Morris suffered the same fate, basically. So anyway, sorry, getting back to Bob Neighbors. His brother Morris Neighbors sustained multiple wounds when a ship, the USS Leutze, was hit by a kamikaze off the coast of Okinawa on 6 April 1945. So Morris Neighbors lived, but he obviously was wounded during the war.
Hmm.
Unfortunately, 18 days later, another brother, Carl Neighbors, was serving as a coxswain aboard the USS Frederick C. Davis off the coast of Newfoundland, so in Canada. The ship
Right.
was struck by a torpedo from a German U-boat, and Carl Neighbors was one of 115 men that perished in the sinking. So
Oh.
Bob Neighbors makes it through World War II unscathed, but already he's had a wife get killed. He's had a brother get hit by a kamikaze and suffer wounds. And then he's had another brother get killed during World War II. So he's already had a lot of loss in his life.
Hmm.
So after the Second World War ends, Bob Neighbors opted to remain in the military rather than continue to pursue a career in baseball. After a decade of service, Major Bob Neighbors saw combat in the Korean War while serving with the 13th Bomb Squadron of the 3rd Bombardment Wing. So basically, 10 years after he joins up for World War II, this is 1952 at this point, he is sent over to Korea during the Korean War to fly combat missions. So on August 8th, 1952, Major Bob Neighbors volunteered to undertake a bombing run over North Korea. So my understanding from reading the Saber Bio Project was that this mission was assigned to someone else. It was a nighttime bombing raid
Right.
over and I'll get into this, but over a kind of a hot zone, I guess, for lack of a better
Right.
term. And the pilot of the other plane basically gets sick, and Bob Neighbors and his crew, it's a 3-man crew, Bob Neighbors and his crew volunteer to take the mission, this
Right.
dangerous mission. So that's
Right. Yeah,
already
it might be
heroic.
worth pointing out that nighttime bombing raids at this time are like the most dangerous thing you can do as a bombardier.
Yeah, they are
Uh,
dangerous. I mean, at this point they have radar and things like that equipped, so it's not quite as much of a death sentence as it probably was in like early World War II, but it's not something you want to be doing.
right.
So on August 8th, 1952, he volunteers to undertake this bombing run. He departed a Douglas A-26 Invader, so it's sort of a light bomber. It's supposed to be in and out. It's a really fast airplane. He
Right.
departs in a Douglas A-26 Invader bomber alongside First Lieutenant William L. Holcomb and Staff Sergeant Grady M. Weeks. And I just want to point out, I'm including the other people's names because they might not be baseball players, but these are also people who served and who a lot of
Yeah.
times got killed or wounded, and I think that's important to note. So anyway, he departs with First Lieutenant William L. Holcomb and Staff Sergeant Grady M. Weeks. The mission was dangerous as 2 other invaders had been down in the same area over the past month, and another one will be lost only 2 days later. So basically, in a month span, they lose 4 aircraft, which is not good. And Bob Neighbors knows this heading out, and he decides to do it anyway. At 9:30 p.m., the 3-man crew of Neighbors' plane radioed back that they had been hit and were bailing out. The 3 men were never heard from again. The Neighbors' family held out hope that Bob had only been captured and not killed, but that hope faded a year later when the war ended and he was not among the prisoners returned to the United States. So imagine how
Oof.
terrible that is for his family. You know that he goes down, you know that he's missing in action, and your best hope is, oh, maybe he's only in the hands of the enemy, which is still not what you want. But you
Right.
have that hope that maybe he's alive, something, the war will end and he'll come back. And then in 1953, the war ends and they repatriate all their prisoners, and Bob Neighbors isn't among them, and now you know that he's dead.
Right.
That's got to be horrible. So the
Yeah, we
story's
like to
not
imagine. I mean, you see like the images from the end of World War II that it's this big celebration. But yeah, it is important to remember that the end of a war is not a big celebration for everybody.
for everyone.
So
Yeah.
this family, unfortunately, the end of the war is when they find out for certain that you know that their relative is gone now. So
Right.
we
Right.
have to
So
keep that in mind as well.
the story's not quite over. but they find out that Bob Neighbors is in fact dead. Bob
Hmm.
Neighbors left behind his second wife, Kathleen, and their young son, Cameron. Kathleen Neighbors remarried Lieutenant Colonel Ed Fells, who adopted his son Cameron, and Cameron Fells went on to serve in the Air Force himself, just like his father. So I thought that was interesting. And I read
Okay.
somewhere that at a Memorial Day ceremony somewhere, Bud Selig was the commissioner at the time, and he placed a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier, basically to honor all the MLB players who have been killed. And he had Cameron Fells, Bob's son, in the audience, and he said some words to him, something along the lines of like, a grateful nation thanks you, something like that. And like, we can never thank you enough for your service and your father's service and your stepfather. So I thought that was interesting that he, in particular, was at least honored by MLB as a player who died. So 34-year-old Bob Neighbors was the only major leaguer killed in the Korean War and the only big leaguer to die in the service of his country since World War II. So thus ends our list of players who have been killed. Obviously, serving in the military and playing in Major League Baseball is an incredibly rare thing now that we have an all volunteer army, people don't get
Hmm.
drafted. And also now that athletes are at such a high level that you basically have to be training your entire life to make it to that point, you can't really do two things. There
Right.
are two
Well,
guys I
and
want
there's
to point
so
out.
much money invested in these guys that MLB teams are going to do anything they
Yeah,
can
they're not
to
gonna. Yeah,
keep them
well, I
from
remember.
having to go over.
You remember Brian Pena? He was like a backup catcher on the
Yeah.
Reds. I
Hmm.
remember at one point he was a Cuban guy, and I guess he uh, gained
Must have
citizenship in the
defected,
United
right?
States. Yeah, but I guess he acquired citizenship in the United States. And I remember at one point he was like really patriotic, and he announced that he was joining the Army Reserve, and he was going to do that like during his off time in from Major League Baseball. And I guess
Okay.
the Reds or the Cardinals or whoever he was playing with was like, you can't do that.
Yeah, they're
And
like,
so
no.
yeah, so I remember he had to like pull it back and be like, "Oh, I'm going to try and work with the USO then, or something to like do my part." So that's just like a reason, and I don't blame MLB teams. Like it's not really a need that the country faces right now.
Hmm.
So I don't blame them. But that was something interesting. But I do want to point out two guys really fast. There were a handful of MLB players I think who served during Vietnam. And I know there were a lot of guys because there was a draft back then who served in like a reserve capacity. I know Nolan Ryan and I think Rod Carew were both guys who served in like the Army Reserve or the National Guard during that. But these
Hmm.
like after the Korea, really after World War II, you didn't have MLB players seeing combat at all. Obviously,
Right.
Bob Neighbors is an exception because he stayed in long enough to see Korea. And then after Vietnam, there hasn't been a draft. It's not really been a thing. But there are two guys
Right.
that I want to point out, and these aren't casualties, but there's a guy named Mitch Harris on the Cardinals, I think in 2015, and a guy named Chris Rowley, who pitched for the Blue Jays a couple of years ago, I think 2018, 2019. And Rowley went to West Point, and then he served in the Army. And then Harris was an Annapolis guy. He went to the Naval Academy, and then he served aboard an aircraft carrier. And they both later went on after their big league or after their military career to play in the big leagues. And there's one more guy named Noah Song, who was a Rule 5 pick of the Phillies this past year. He was another Annapolis guy. He graduated. He was a naval aviator. I think he's like 23, 24 years old. And he
Hmm.
now has been put on like inactive duty, basically. He's like a reservist. And he's like with the Phillies now, he's technically a major leaguer because he's on the major league injured list. And at some
Right.
point, he could be another guy who, if the Phillies deem so, he could become a major leaguer who has now served. So that would be three guys recently. But
Okay.
yeah, I think the days of major leaguers seeing combat is probably over. There might be an exception
Right.
here and there, but I'm glad to say that as far as I can tell, I think this list will be done, which is
Right.
good.
Yeah. I mean, the only way you would ever see it is if some like cataclysmic war broke out.
Right.
And, that's one, there's no good way to predict something like that. And two,
No.
it's not the sort of thing that you want to talk about. You
No,
don't want to
no.
be
Or
like,
I
how do
guess the
you
Pat
think World War III is going to
yeah.
start, Ethan?
I guess the
So,
Pat Tillman thing could happen where somebody could have a career and then decide to go into the military and maybe
right.
die that way. But yeah, like you said, these aren't really things that we should keep talking about.
Right.
So
Plus,
let's just
our time does draw to a close.
yeah, this is already going to be a long episode.
Yes. But
Are
it's
there
worth
any?
being long.
It's totally worth being long. Are there any last thoughts that you have on any of this or any of the players or anything?
I mean, I think we were more than willing to, to branch off for a little bit to talk about, things that we thought needed to be brought up. So I think we've covered most of what, and I think we've covered everything I would want to cover.
Yeah,
I could talk about, MLB's Memorial Day hats or whatever and what I think of them, but that's not really the time for it. So
No. Well, yeah,
maybe maybe on
we
a
did have
different
that.
episode.
We did have that discussion beforehand where we sort of were like, maybe we should try and tone it down a little bit and not be silly and stuff because
Right.
it's
You've
not
noticed there
really
have been zero
proper.
drops in this episode.
Yeah, there's been zero drops. Um, but yeah, I think it's important that we remember these people, and they're all not household names, which I think is
Right.
important. So we could do an episode later and talk about Ted Williams and Warren Spahn and stuff. But I think it's
Yeah.
important that we
And
talk
I
about.
think we will,
Yeah, yeah, I would like to, but I think it's important that we talk about these guys. So I just hope that people, keep that in mind. And I guess I know it's sort of cliche, but Memorial Day isn't just a day off from school, and it's not just a day
Right.
off from work. And you're like, yeah, go barbecue, it's fun. Like that's the
Yeah.
point. But like really, the point of it is to remember that people had to die so that we could have this great life that
Right.
we have. So I think we
Yeah.
should.
The way I look at it is, remember this, honor the people who gave their life for the country and then go party.
Exactly,
Because if
yeah.
they were here, that's what they would be doing.
Right, that's what they were doing.
So,
Right.
not to, make a downer episode or anything. I know we're usually like pretty goofy. And, I don't think it was just entirely, just iron face, let's talk about things that suck.
No, I think
know?
we're loose enough.
But, yeah, like it's not appropriate to be like, blasting Sopranos drops while we're talking about this
Right.
sort of thing. So, that was a decision that we made. Don't worry, the board is not gone. It will be back in the next episode. I don't think I would be able to part with it for more than one episode anyway. I have too much fun with it. But
absolutely.
But yeah, so
we do have one thing upcoming that I would like to talk about for a second.
Ooh,
I know we got to
okay.
get out of here. But I just want to say I reached out. As everybody knows, we're big Australian Baseball League fans.
Yes.
And I love the Australian Baseball League. I've loved watching it over the past few years. I think it's growing. I think it's great. And baseball in Australia is better for it. However,
and we love seeing what Australia was able to do in the World Baseball Classic.
Yes, Australia.
Let's not overlook it.
They had a historic run. And also, Liam Hendricks is on his way back to a major league mound. He's doing a rehab assignment after overcoming cancer. Liam Hendricks, awesome.
Yeah.
However, the Australian Baseball League was dealt a bit of a blow. They went from 6 teams a few years ago. They expanded to 8 teams. They added a team. They have 6 teams in Australia. They added another one in Geelong. That's a Korean team. It's like a KBO farm team, basically. Mm-hmm. And then they have another team in Auckland, the Auckland Tuatara, which is in New Zealand. And under normal circumstances, that's no problem. The two countries have a very amicable relationship. It's very easy to go back and forth. It worked out great. So the 2019 season was really, really good. They built off of that the 2020 season. So before the pandemic, they did really, really well. They set records in attendance. They made the playoffs. Baseball in New Zealand was on the rise. It was excellent. Then the pandemic happened.
They were probably the most fun team in the ABL.
They probably were. And they had some big leaguers. They had like Josh Colementor play for them and stuff like that. It was really cool.
However, we got some gear, some Auckland Tuatara gear.
We do. We got some gear. It was really cool. They were awesome. However, the problem was the pandemic happens. That obviously derails everything. The league shuts down for a season. They come back. And the Tuatara face a mountain of issues. The Australian Baseball League as a whole faces a lot of issues because Australia was pretty like draconian with the COVID-19 lockdowns and stuff like that. But it was
they went hard. They went hard worse because as opposed to going home.
Right. It was even worse because the Tuatara had to not only deal with Australia's regulations, they had to deal with New Zealand's regulations as well, and the issue of travel back and forth. And on top of that, they had a bunch of their home games rained out. So they lost out on a lot of revenue from that. So basically, to make it quick, everything conspired against the Tuatara. They lost a bunch of money. I think they filed for bankruptcy. If not, they basically weren't able to pay their creditors, and they had to suspend operations. So the Tuatara are done. They are now in the liquidation process. And it seems as though baseball in New Zealand, at least on a professional level, is over, and I don't know if it's going to come back. The reason I know about all this is because I read an article, I think it's called stuff.com.new Zealand, and it's just like an online newspaper. And the guy who wrote the article was called David Long, and I clicked on his author tab, and he had a bunch of articles about the Auckland Tuatara, and he had an article basically summarizing the fall of the Auckland Tuatara, everything that went wrong, and why this happened. And I went, wow, this is really interesting. I didn't know about a lot of this. So I just emailed him and was like, hey, David, I have this podcast. Would you like to come on and talk about the Tuatara? He said, great, no problem. So we will be having David on at some point to share his, I guess, expertise his
His
insight.
insight.
Yeah,
There you go.
we'll have David on to share his insight into the Auckland Tuatara and anything else about the Australian Baseball League he wants to talk about. So that's something to
Yeah.
look forward to, because I want to learn about like the ins and outs of what happened and why it didn't work out. So
Right.
that's that. If you want to hit us up about anything, feel free to reach out at the baseball pod 2 at Gmail, or on Twitter, and the baseball pod at gmail.com. No, sorry, it's the baseball podcast 2 on Twitter, and the
There
baseball
you go.
pod at gmail.com. Feel free to email us if you want to come on the show. If you have any questions, if you want to make fun of us, that's perfectly fine. So
That would
anyway,
arguably be
that
preferable.
would be the best. Yeah, we already had a few blasting us, so we might as well add to it. This is a long episode. Thank you for sticking with us. I think it was an important thing to do. Any other
Yeah.
words you want to say, Tom?
No, I think I'm ready to wrap it up, as they say. You know, I would never say anything like that, but that's
I
what
wouldn't be
some
caught
people
dead.
call it.
Yeah. Well,
So
everyone,
again, unfortunately, no drops. So our traditional ending. I don't even have the soundboard open. So
yeah. Look
uh,
forward to it in the next episode of the
yeah,
Baseball Podcast.
the baseball podcast. Then you know what? Why don't we do it manual? As always,
His name is Dan
is
Uglow.
Dan Uglow.
Thanks for
And he will
listening.
see you on the next one.